The first letter arrived in Oregon City on a Tuesday in late June, and Thomas Aldrin set it on the kitchen table without opening it. He wasn't sure why. He was not a man who hesitated over things. He had come west alone 6 years ago with a mule and a wagon and less money than he should have had, and he had built a house with his own hands and broken 40 acres of ground that the Willamette Valley rain was slowly turning into something that might be called a farm. He was not given to delay. He did not sit with things, but the letter sat on his table, and he went to bed without touching it, 2 nights in a row, aware of it in the dark the way you are aware of something that might change the shape of what comes next. On the 3rd morning, he opened it over coffee. Her name was Clara Marsh. She had been a school teacher in Hannibal, Missouri, and before that, the wife of a man named Robert who had died of fever 2 winters ago, leaving her with a daughter of 7 and a debt she had spent 14 months paying down $1 at a time. She was 31 years old. She was not, she wrote, pretty in the way people sometimes say to be kind, but she had good eyes and a steady disposition. She knew how to put up preserves and how to keep a household through a lean winter, and she believed in plain language between people who were going to have to trust each other. She thought he ought to know these things before she arrived, so there would be no surprises on either side. She had written the letter before leaving Independence. She had given it to a postwriter with instructions to send it ahead to Oregon City so that Thomas Aldrin, whose name she knew from a single arrangement made through his sister in Saint-Louis, Joseph, would have time to read it and think, while she was still somewhere on the eastern end of the Platte River. Thomas read it twice. Then he folded it back into its envelope and put it in the breast pocket of his coat and went out to his fields. He didn't know yet that there were more coming. This is the story of what those letters built. Across 2,000 miles of trail and 6 months of a summer neither of them would ever fully forget. And what was waiting on the other side of all that distance when they were finally standing in the same room. Clara Marsh had left Independence, Missouri on the 14th of May, 1857, in a company of 31 wagons led by a man named Horace Dent who had made the crossing 4 times and charged accordingly. She had a single wagon, 2 oxen she had named without sentiment, the larger one she called Dollar, the smaller one Cents, a daughter named Iris who was 7½ and had her father's forehead and her mother's stubbornness, and 4 trunks of belongings that Dent had told her were 2 trunks too many. She had left 2 trunks behind at a farmhouse outside Independence. She had not cried about it. She had a long way to go, and she knew even then that the leaving had to be practiced, that there would be more of it before she was done. What Clara feared most, though she would not have said so to anyone on that first morning when the wagons lurched westward and the Missouri skyline fell behind them, was that she was making a fool of herself, that she would walk 2,000 miles and arrive half dead at the door of a stranger who took one look at her and found the whole arrangement a mistake. She had known enough of that particular feeling, of arriving somewhere and realizing you were not what was wanted, to dread it more than the river crossings or the mountains or the cholera that everyone whispered about at night. She could face a river. She was not sure she could face another man's disappointment without it breaking something in her that she had been carefully mending. She didn't tell Thomas any of that, not in the first letter. But she did tell him about Iris, about the way her daughter had pressed her face against the canvas that first night and asked if they could still see Missouri from where they were, and about how Clara had said no, and Iris had considered this for a moment, and then said, well, at least we can't see it either, and had gone to sleep. Clara put this in the second letter, written at the Platte River on a Sunday evening when the light was going gold over the water, and Iris was already asleep, and Clara had nothing else to do but watch the river and write. That letter reached Thomas in mid-July. He read it at the kitchen table after supper, still in his work clothes, and he found himself reading the part about Iris twice, the child's particular logic, the small bravery of it, and he thought about the kind of woman who could raise a daughter like that alone through 2 hard years and still be capable of noticing gold light on a river and thinking to put it in a letter. He was not falling in love yet. He was only beginning to pay attention. The trail was hard in the way that the trail was always hard, which is to say harder than anyone told you it would be and harder than you let yourself imagine in advance, because if you had imagined it truly you would not have come. The mud at the first Platte crossing took an hour and 3 men and a great deal of profanity to get Clara's wagon through, and Dollar and Cents stood in the current with an expression of profound bovine patience while the effort went on around them. Iris sat on top of the wagon with her arms wrapped around her knees and watched the whole thing with the focused attention of a child who has decided that the world is at least never boring. There was a woman in the company named Edna Price who was traveling with her husband and 4 sons and who had decided within the first week that Clara Marsh was someone to be watched. Not with suspicion, with the careful assessment that women on the trail made of one another, calculating without unkindness who was going to hold and who was going to fold before the mountains. Edna Price watched Clara get her wagon through the Platte and decided she was a holder. After that she was kind to her in the specific, practical way of a woman who does not waste kindness on people who don't need it. Clara wrote about Edna Price in the 3rd letter. She wrote, "There is a woman in this company who reminds me of my mother in the way that a river in flood reminds you of a river in drought. Same river, different season. She does not say much, but she sees everything. I find I am grateful for her in the way you are grateful for a wall when the wind is coming from the east." Thomas read that letter in August, when the rains had come early to the Willamette Valley, and he was stuck indoors with the restlessness that confined men feel. He read it 3 times. He thought about the precision of it, the flood and the drought and the same river, and he thought, this woman has a mind that notices things. He had begun to find himself thinking about her at odd moments. Not constantly, and not yet with anything he would have called longing. But she would appear to him at the edge of his thoughts. Not her face, which he couldn't know, but her voice, which the letters were building for him, word by word. The trouble came at the North Platte crossing in late June, which Clara wrote about in the 4th letter, and which Thomas did not receive until the end of August. There had been a river crossing. There was always a river crossing. But this one had gone wrong in the particular way that crossings went wrong on the trail. Quietly and then all at once. One of the wagons ahead of hers lost a wheel mid-river. Not a dramatic break, but a slow split that only showed itself when the wheel was already in 4 feet of moving water. And in the scramble to help, 2 men lost their footing on the slick river bottom. One of them was pulled 30 yards downstream before another man caught him. No one died. But it took 6 hours, and by the end of it Clara's oxen were spooked and her wagon had taken on 4 inches of water, and Iris had spent the entire crossing on Clara's hip, silent, with her face pressed against her mother's neck. Clara wrote about this without drama. She described the sound of the wheel splitting, not loud, she wrote, quieter than you'd think, more of a giving up sound than a breaking sound. She described the weight of her daughter against her. She wrote, "I kept thinking, one bank to the other bank. That is all. That is the only thought that is useful. I have decided this is probably true of most things." Thomas received this letter on a Thursday and read it standing at his gate, having taken it from the postwriter before he even made it back to the house. He read it in the dimming afternoon light, and when he finished it he stood still for a longer moment than he would have admitted to anyone. One bank to the other bank. He went inside and made his supper and sat at the table with the letter still in his hand, thinking about a woman in the middle of a river with a child on her hip, thinking that thought, and moving anyway. He did not know what to call what he was feeling. He set it aside. He slept poorly that night. By September, Clara was past Fort Laramie. The company had lost 1 man to dysentery near Scottsbluff and a child to fever 3 days later, a boy of 4 from a family out of Ohio named Harmon, and the whole company had stood in silence at the grave while his father said what words he could manage. Clara had held Iris's hand very tightly. Iris had not cried. Afterward, she had asked her mother if Thomas Aldrin would be kind, and Clara had said she believed so, and Iris had said that was good, because she thought they had both used up most of their sad and they needed somewhere kind to go. Clara put this in the 5th letter. She sent it from Fort Laramie. This was the letter Thomas was reading when his neighbor came by on a Saturday morning and found him still at the table at 10 o'clock, unwashed, his coffee gone cold. His neighbor said something, and Thomas said he would be out in a moment, and his neighbor looked at the letter in Thomas's hand and said nothing further and left. Thomas didn't write back to Clara. There was no way to write back. no address to reach her on a trail that moved 15 miles a day and had no fixed position. He could only receive, he could only read and know her in the one direction he was given, and wait. He began to understand that waiting for the letters was the shape his days had taken. The sixth letter came from South Pass, Wyoming, at an elevation of just over 7,000 feet, and it was this letter, this one in particular, that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. She had written it at night. She said so at the start. "I am writing this by the light of a candle I cannot really afford to burn, because I have been lying awake and I find I cannot sleep and I have no one to talk to, so I am talking to you." She wrote about where she was, the highest point of the Continental Divide, the place where the rivers stopped flowing east and began to flow west, the place the guides called the top of the world. She wrote about the cold, which at that elevation in late August was real and sharp and had ice in its edges. She wrote about the stars, which she said were unlike any she had seen in Missouri, not more numerous exactly, but closer, as if the altitude had removed some barrier between herself and them. And then she wrote something she had not planned to write. She knew it even as she did it. She could tell by the way her hand slowed, by the way she paused at the end of a sentence and did not immediately begin the next one. She wrote, "I have been thinking, up here, about whether I am brave or simply stubborn. I have been thinking about this for a long time, actually, since Missouri, but up here the question seems more important. Brave would mean I am doing this because I believe in what is ahead. Stubborn would mean I am doing this because I cannot stand the idea of turning back. I have decided it doesn't matter. The oxen can't tell the difference and neither can Iris, and the trail doesn't care either way. But I thought you should know that I'm not sure which one I am, because I think it is the kind of thing a person ought to tell the person they are going to." There was a gap, a half line of white space where she had paused, and then she continued, "There is no sound up here at night except the wind and occasionally an ox. It is not a peaceful quiet, it is a vast one. I think there is a difference. I am going to try to sleep now. I thought you should know I made it this far." Thomas received this letter in the last week of September. He had been at the table long enough that the morning light had shifted to afternoon by the time he set it down. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. He knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who is not given to self-deception, that something had happened to him somewhere in that letter. Not at the stars, though that was beautiful. At the question, at "I'm not sure which one I am, because I think it is the kind of thing a person ought to tell the person they are going to." She had told him a true thing, the truest thing anyone had told him in a long time, and she had told it not because she knew him, but because she was going to him, and she had decided that was reason enough for honesty. He understood, sitting at that table in the rain-gray light of a Willamette Valley September, that he was in love with a woman he had never seen, that he had been in one way or another since the Platte River, that Wyoming had simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise. He got up. He went out to his fields. He worked until dark with the focused energy of a man who has resolved something. October brought no letters. He watched the post rider come and go twice a week and told himself this meant nothing. The trail had no reliable mail from the Snake River Plain onward. The distances were too great, the riders too few. He knew this. He had known it since June. But knowing a thing and being easy about it are different propositions, and by the third week of October he was sleeping badly and working with a grim productivity his neighbor had learned to recognize as the behavior of a man who is trying not to think. He had done the mathematics. A wagon company leaving Independence in mid-May, moving at the expected pace, should reach the Dalles no earlier than mid-October and no later than early November, weather willing. 2 more days after the Dalles to Oregon City. He did not need to count on his fingers. He had already counted. Weather, he knew from 6 years in this country, was not always willing. The Blue Mountains were the last great difficulty, a cold, dark range in eastern Oregon that every experienced traveler named alongside the Platte crossings and the Snake River as the places where the trail finally asked everything it had left to ask. He had crossed them himself 6 years ago in a snowfall that came 3 days before anyone expected it. He had not looked back. He stood at his window some evenings and looked east, which was not something he had done in 6 years, and he thought, keep moving. And then, she knows how. She already knows. Clara arrived in Oregon City on the 22nd of November, a Wednesday, at 3:30 in the afternoon, in a company that had been reduced to 12 miles a day for the last 2 weeks by rain and exhausted oxen and roads that had become suggestions. She was thinner than she had been in May. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles from 6 months of cold and wet and work, and there was a scar on her left forearm from a cook fire accident near Fort Boise that she had not put in any letter because she had not seen the point of worrying him over something already healed. Her coat was the same one she had left Missouri in, but it fit differently now. Looser at the shoulders, which had become angular and strong in ways she was not fully aware of. Iris was beside her on the wagon seat, asleep against her mother's arm despite the jolting of the road, her face warm with the particular heat that children carry even in cold weather. Thomas was at the edge of town. He had been there since noon. He had not planned to be early. He had told himself he would arrive at a reasonable hour like a reasonable man. He had been at the edge of town since noon. When her wagon came into view, he recognized it before he could have said how. Single wagon, 2 oxen, one considerably larger than the other, just as she had described in the first letter. He stood at the roadside and watched her bring them to a halt, and he watched her look around in the manner of someone arriving somewhere new, assessing, calibrating, the way you do when you have been moving for 6 months and have finally stopped. She saw him before he said anything. He was not sure how. He was one man among a dozen standing at the edge of a muddy November street. But she looked directly at him, and he did not look away. She climbed down from the wagon herself, without waiting for assistance, which he had expected. She was not as tall as he had pictured. He wasn't sure what he had pictured. He thought he had been picturing her voice all along, not her face, and her face was a surprise, not a disappointment, not at all, only the particular surprise that reality always delivers when you have been building something in your mind for 6 months. She walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Aldrin," she said. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. There was a pause that had 6 months of letters inside it. She looked at him steadily with those eyes she had described in the first letter. Good eyes, she had called them, which was an understatement in the way that the Platte River is a somewhat substantial creek. She was assessing him. He did not mind. He stood still and let her. "You look like someone who reads carefully," she said. "I do," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did the letters arrive?" "I was never certain how far ahead of me they were traveling." "They arrived," he said. "All of them?" "All 7. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, but the thing that lives just beneath it. "I wasn't always sure what I was writing," she said. "Some of them I looked back at what I'd put down and wasn't sure it was appropriate. For strangers." "We're not strangers," Thomas said. She looked at him. "I know about dollar and cents," he said. "I know about the Harmon boy and about Edna Price and about one bank to the other bank. I know about Wyoming." He paused. "I don't think you're a stranger to me. I haven't thought so for quite some time." She was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them. Other wagons, other arrivals, the general noise of a place receiving a company of people who have walked 2,000 miles and need somewhere to put all that distance. "Wyoming," she said. "Yes, what about Wyoming?" He considered how to say it. He was not a man who spoke easily in this kind of language, but he had been waiting since October, and he did not see the purpose of talking around it now. "There was a letter from South Pass," he said, "about brave or stubborn, about the kind of thing a person ought to tell the person they are going to." He looked at her. "I think I fell in love with you somewhere in that letter, maybe earlier, but Wyoming is where I knew it clearly." Clara Marsh stood in the November afternoon at the end of the Oregon Trail and looked at this man she had been writing to across 2,000 miles, this man she had told her true things to because he was a stranger and then kept telling them to because something in her had decided he deserved them. Iris had woken up on the wagon seat. She was watching all of this with the interested attention of a child who has learned that the world, at minimum, is never boring. Thomas held out his hand. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. They stood there in the cold November light, at the end of one thing and the beginning of everything else. Behind them, Dollar and cents stood in the road with the unimpressed patience of oxen who have walked 2,000 miles and are ready, by now, to simply be done. Iris climbed down from the wagon by herself. "Is this it?" she asked. Clara looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Clara. "Yes," her mother said. "This is it."